Hi there, my name is Giulio Fornaroli and I work at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, with a Polonaise fellowship, which is part of the Marie Curie initiative. Imagine you've been invited by a friend to spend some time at their place. While you're there, you move your hands a bit absent-mindedly without thinking too much about what you're doing, and you accidentally drop and destroy a precious object. Could be this old gramophone, for example, or my late grandfather's portrait. What are you supposed to do? Well, presumably you have to apologize, maybe volunteer to help repair the object if it can still be repaired, or find a replacement, things like that. Next, take a car accident. Suppose you are driving again a bit distractedly and you bump into another car. What are you supposed to do? Well, in that case, the answer is already offered to you by the law. This is an area of personal interactions that is highly regulated by the law that already tells you exactly what kind of liability that you're under for this kind of conduct. And finally, take historical reparations, the thorny issue of what kinds of reparations are needed for wrongs that happened in the past, whose perpetrators are all long dead, but that still have a significant impact on how societies nowadays are organized. What do these three scenarios have in common? Well, they all deal, I think, with corrections, with what we as moral agents or others have to do to make up for the wrongs that we have inflicted on others. In a paper that is now forthcoming in legal theory, I analyze the question of what corrections are, and I focus specifically on corrective duties, the duties that we have to make up for the wrongs that we have inflicted on others. And as we often do in philosophy, I start off with a critical survey of the literature to show that all extant positions are, for some reason, unsatisfactory, and then I suggest an alternative account. So I start with a very old story that we've probably all heard since childhood and that we can retrieve pretty much everywhere from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics to the commentaries on the law of England of the great 18th century British jurist William Blackstone, which says, in essence, that what you ought to do if you want to correct is repair the damage. Um, Make it as if the damage had never occurred, or more precisely, make sure that the condition of the victim of your wronging is as good as it was before the wronging, or as if the wronging had never occurred. And even though we've all heard this story is pretty widespread, I also think that it's ultimately wrong. Why that? Well, first of all, because it seems to ignore the question of the moral injury that always comes with wrong. Whenever we wrong others, we do not simply create a damage. When we do, we also interact with them in a manner that is disrespectful. And we want a theory of corrections and corrective duties to respond to this aspect, to this moral aspect. Secondly, that old story I think is wrong because it ignores the fact that very often the entity of a damage, how much one needs to pay to repay the damage, depends on circumstances that are completely outside of the wrongdoer's control and that relate very poorly with the gravity of moral injury. So sometimes a mere distraction can cause incalculable damages, whereas much graver examples of moral injury can cause no damage whatsoever. Think about an attempted murder, for example. So I think that old story is ultimately to be rejected. I then move on to consider another popular account that says that wronging other essentially means violating their right to freedom. It's a story that is associated with some bits of Kantian ethics, and I also reject that. First, because it gives a somewhat awkward reconstruction of what wronging ultimately is. And secondly, because it doesn't tell us what to do when we wrong others. It simply tells us what wrong is sort of reducible to, but it doesn't tell us what wrongdoers should do. And finally, I consider a new addition to the literature, the so-called continuity view. And the continuity view starts from a very plausible assumption. The assumption is whenever you wrong others and you're required to correct, it's always because you have breached some kind of requirement that you are subject to at the moment. And that's fair enough. But then it also says that correcting just means attempting to do what you were supposed to do before. And I find it quite implausible in many situations. Now consider again my initial example, right? Presumably what I was supposed to do when I was visiting a friend's place was being considerate. I had the duty of care towards my friend and their possessions since I was visiting their places. And what I'm supposed to do now, after destroying the object, is, as I was saying before, apologizing, maybe volunteer to help, etc. And are we sure that we can redescribe these corrective acts as way of attempting to do what I was supposed to do before, namely being considerate? How can apologizing be interpreted as a way of being considerate towards my friend's possessions? I find that quite implausible, and because of that, I reject that account too, and I suggest instead an alternative view. And the alternative view focuses on the moral injury head on. And it says that we wrong others whenever we neglect them in our practical deliberation. Now, our practical deliberation is quite simply the way we decide how to act. And when we decide how to act, when we decide what to do, we can obviously also decide how much others are relevant for our deliberation. We can decide the weight that others will play in our deliberation. And I suggest that we wrong others when essentially these others play either a very minimal or an inadequate role in our deliberation. When we don't consider them enough or we consider them inadequately in deciding what to do. So, in the recurring example again, I am wronging my friend when I act distractedly in their place because instead of focusing on the fact that the way I move my body and my hands can cause damages to them, I simply ignore this. I don't care enough about this possibility. And that's the wronging. And that's how I demonstrate to my friend that in that moment, at least, he or she didn't matter enough in my deliberation. And that's also, I think, what we need to correct. And correcting, I think, has to do with counterbalancing this moral neglect, this demonstration of not caring enough about um, others. And I think that there are a host of social practices that have precisely that aim. First of all, apologizing. By apologizing, we essentially want to show others that they do care in our deliberation, even though we didn't demonstrate it before. And that's it, essentially. That's the story of the paper. That's how I think corrective duties should be analyzed. And I have a final section in which I talk a bit about the uh, different role of corrective and distributive justice, but that part is sort of embryonic for now. So if you want to know more, the paper, as I was saying, is coming out soon in legal theory.